The old Camp Lakewood sign hung crookedly at the entrance, its paint peeling and faded by years of neglect and harsh weather. This was the place that parents sent their kids for a week of fun in the sun, away from technology and the comforts of home. Yet, behind the laughter and campfire songs, darker stories were whispered among the children and staff, stories that seemed too chilling to be true. The summer of 1997 was particularly memorable, marked by an unusual series of events that began with the arrival of a group of unsuspecting campers. Among them was Jamie, a curious and somewhat timid boy who had heard the rumors of Camp Lakewood's haunted past but dismissed them as mere campfire tales, meant to scare the kids. The first few days passed without incident. The campers engaged in the usual activities, canoeing, hiking, and gathering around the campfire at night where the counselors would tell ghost stories, enhancing them with eerie sounds and strategic flashlight pointing to spook the younger kids. It was on the fourth night that things began to change. The air grew thick with a sudden fog that rolled in from the lake, enveloping the camp in a dense, wet blanket that seemed to muffle sound and dim the lights of the cabins. Jamie lay in his bunk, listening to the soft snores of his cabin mates when he heard the first whispers. At first, he thought it was one of the other boys talking in their sleep, but as he strained his ears, he realized that the whispers were coming from outside, near the window at the back of the cabin. The words were indistinct, a soft, hissing sound that sent shivers down his spine. Jamie clutched his blanket tighter and stared wide-eyed into the darkness, too scared to move. The next morning, Jamie was pale and quiet at breakfast. When his friends asked him what was wrong, he just shook his head, not wanting to admit he was spooked by what might easily have been his imagination. However, that day, other campers began to report strange occurrences, items going missing from their bags, seeing shadows flit between the trees when walking back from activities, and an unsettling feeling of being watched. The cheerful atmosphere of the camp began to shift, whispers turned into concerned conversations among the counselors, who insisted that the campers were just trying to scare each other. But Jamie knew it was not just imagination or pranks. That night, he was awakened by the sound of footsteps outside the cabin. Peering out the small window, he saw a figure moving stealthily between the cabins. It was not one of the counselors. The figure was too tall, its movements too jerky. Gathering his courage, Jamie decided to follow the figure the next night. He pretended to sleep, then, dressed warmly, he quietly slipped out of his bunk and tiptoed out of the cabin. The night was moonless, the only light coming from his small flashlight. He followed the figure at a distance, watching as it moved with a purpose towards the old boathouse, a place rumored to be haunted and off-limits to campers. As Jamie approached, the door to the boathouse creaked open slowly. The figure slipped inside, and Jamie hesitated at the threshold. The air was cold here, colder than it should have been on a summer night, and the water lapped quietly against the posts of the boathouse in a steady, rhythmic beat that seemed almost deliberate. Swallowing his fear, Jamie stepped inside. The boathouse was cluttered with old fishing gear, canoes, and life jackets thrown carelessly in a pile. The figure stood at the far end, its back to Jamie, hunched over an old trunk that Jamie had never seen before. It was then that Jamie noticed the smell, a mix of mold, wet earth, and something rotten, like decayed wood or worse, decayed flesh. As he moved closer, the figure turned, and Jamie could see its face in the dim light. It was wrong, horribly wrong. The eyes were too deep, the skin a pallid gray, stretched tight over its bones. It smiled, revealing a row of jagged teeth, and spoke in a voice that was a rasping whisper, "Found you." Jamie wanted to run, to scream, but his feet were rooted to the spot. The figure moved closer, its movements unnatural, as if every step was a chore. Just as it reached out with a gnarled hand, a shout from outside broke the spell. The door burst open, letting in the light and voices of Jamie's friends and a counselor who had followed them, worried about their absence. The figure recoiled from the light, its form seeming to dissolve into the shadows of the boathouse, disappearing before anyone else could get a good look at it. Jamie was found trembling, unable to explain clearly what he had seen. The counselor, seeing Jamie's terrified state and the confusion among the other campers, decided it was best to get everyone back to their cabins and discuss it in the morning. Back in the safety of his cabin, Jamie lay awake, the image of that ghastly, smiling face etched into his mind. He knew sleep would not come easily, if at all. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the trees surrounding the camp, and in its howl, Jamie could almost hear that same whispering voice, calling him, taunting him. The next morning, the camp was abuzz with talk. Jamie's tale, now filtered through the imaginations of several frightened children, became the center of a whirlwind of rumor and fear. The counselors held an emergency meeting to address the situation. They decided to reinforce the camp rules. No one was to wander alone, especially at night, and the boathouse was strictly off-limits. They attributed the night's events to an overactive imagination fueled by too many ghost stories. However, as the day progressed, the unease remained palpable. The fog rolled in again, earlier this time, creeping across the lake and enveloping the camp in its cold embrace. Activities were cut short as a precaution, and everyone was gathered into the main lodge for a head count and early dinner. Jamie sat quietly in the corner, his eyes darting nervously to the windows as the fog pressed against the glass. He felt isolated even in the crowded room, as if he alone was aware of the true danger lurking just beyond their line of sight. As night fell, the counselors decided to hold an indoor campfire session in the lodge, hoping to keep the spirits of the campers high with games and songs. Yet the cheer felt forced, the laughter a bit too shrill. Jamie noticed that the counselors often glanced towards the windows, their faces tight with worry. Halfway through a particularly spirited rendition of a campfire song, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the lodge into darkness. Screams and shouts filled the room as the children panicked, their fears amplified by the darkness. The counselors scrambled, using their flashlights to illuminate the room, casting large, dancing shadows against the walls. Amidst the chaos, Jamie heard it again, that familiar whisper, almost drowned out by the cries of frightened camp and the howling wind outside. It was closer this time, more insistent. "Closer, Jamie, come closer." Ignoring the commotion around him, Jamie felt an irresistible pull towards the source of the voice. His feet moved almost of their own accord, guiding him out of the lodge and into the thick, swirling fog outside. The cold air bit at his skin as he walked, his heart pounding in his chest with both fear and an inexplicable excitement. Behind him, the lodge seemed to recede into the distance, its lights flickering like the dying flames of a campfire. Ahead, the path was murky and obscured by the dense fog, but Jamie moved forward, driven by the whisper that now filled his ears, echoing around him as if carried by the wind itself. The trail led him back to the boathouse. The building loomed out of the fog, its structure old and menacing in the dim light. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting him in. Jamie's hand trembled as he pushed it open, the hinges groaning under the weight of years of disuse. Inside, the air was stale and cold, filled with the scent of old wood and lake water. Jamie's flashlight beam flickered as he stepped further into the darkness, his breath visible in the icy air. The whisper guided him to the back of the boathouse, to the old trunk he had seen the night before. It was here, in this spot, that he had encountered the horrifying figure. But now, the trunk sat closed, dust undisturbed on its lid. Jamie approached it slowly, every instinct screaming for him to turn and flee, yet compelled to see what secrets it held. With a trembling hand, he reached out and lifted the lid. Inside, the trunk was filled with old, moldy books, their covers worn and their pages yellowed with age. Beneath them lay various oddities, old coins, a rusted compass, and a faded photograph of a group of campers from another time, their faces smiling, unaware of the viewer's gaze. But at the very bottom, beneath all the other items, Jamie found a journal. Its cover was leather, cracked and worn, and it seemed to pulse with a life of its own, as if it were breathing. Jamie opened the journal, the pages creaking with stiffness. The handwriting was difficult to read, faded by time, but the words that he could make out sent a chill down his spine. It was a diary of sorts, belonging to someone who had once been a counselor at the camp. The entries spoke of strange happenings, disappearances, mysterious noises in the night, and an ominous presence that seemed to haunt the campgrounds. As Jamie read, the wind outside grew stronger, howling through the cracks in the boathouse walls. He felt a presence behind him, the temperature dropping even further. Turning slowly, he shone his flashlight towards the back of the boathouse. There, in the beam of light, stood the figure he had seen before. Its eyes were hollow, its skin gray and stretched tight over its bones. It reached out with one gnarled hand, pointing at the journal in Jamie's hand. "Read," it rasped, its voice a dry, crackling whisper that filled the space. "Understand." Jamie turned back to the journal, his eyes scanning the pages as he tried to piece together the story it told. The entries became increasingly erratic, filled with terror and warnings. The counselor had discovered something ancient and terrible that dwelt beneath the camp, an entity that fed on fear and sorrow. The final entry was a frantic plea for anyone who found the journal to continue the work that had been started, to find a way to appease the entity or banish it forever. As Jamie read these last words, the figure moved closer, its breath cold on the back of his neck. "We must finish what was started," it whispered, its voice urgent. "You must help us, Jamie. You must." But before Jamie could respond, a loud crash outside startled him. The boy-nom, panicking, dropped the journal and whirled around. The figure was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. Heart-pounding, Jamie picked up the journal, clutching it to his chest as he raced out of the boathouse. Back at the camp, the lights in the lodge were back on, and the campers were being herded into their cabins for the night. Counselors were doing head counts, ensuring everyone was accounted for. Jamie, out of breath and shaken, slipped unnoticed back into his cabin. As he lay in his bunk, the journal under his pillow, Jamie knew that the summer was far from over. There were secrets buried deep within Camp Lakewood, secrets that were now his to uncover. Despite the terror that clenched at his heart, a part of him was driven by an insatiable curiosity and a need to protect his fellow campers from the darkness that lurked beneath the surface. The next few days were a blur of clandestine research and cautious inquiries. Jamie spent every spare moment poring over the journal, deciphering its cryptic references to ancient rituals and the eerie history of the land upon which the camp was built. According to the journal, the land had once been sacred to a forgotten tribe, known for their powerful shamanistic practices. It was here that they had sealed away a malevolent spirit that had plagued their people, using a stone altar hidden somewhere in the forest around the lake. Armed with this knowledge, Jamie enlisted the help of his cabin mate, Mark, who had noticed Jamie's strange behavior and insisted on being let in on the secret. Together, they plotted to locate the stone altar, guided by a crudely drawn map they found tucked between the pages of the journal. Their opportunity came one afternoon during a supervised hike. Straggling behind the group, Jamie and Mark slipped away unnoticed, delving deeper into the forest than they were supposed to. The woods were dense and unwelcoming, the trees ancient and towering, their branches blotting out the sun and casting long shadows that seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The boys' journey was fraught with unease. Every snap of a twig underfoot, every rustle of leaves, heightened their anxiety. They were trespassing into forbidden territory, both physically and spiritually. After what felt like hours, they stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood an ancient stone altar, covered in moss and weathered by time. Its presence was ominous, exuding an aura of power and dread. Mark, visibly shaken, wanted to turn back, but Jamie was determined. He approached the altar with a mixture of reverence and fear, laying a hand upon its cold, rough surface. The air around them grew chillier, and the forest fell silent, as if holding its breath. It was then that they heard it, a low, mournful howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The boys froze, fear rooting them to the spot. The howl grew louder, more desperate. Shadows began to coalesce around the edges of the clearing, dark figures that twisted and writhed like smoke. Mark screamed, breaking the spell that held Jamie in place, and together they fled, the howl chasing them back through the woods. They didn't stop running until they burst into the camp, lungs burning and hearts pounding. The camp was in chaos, counselors and camp officers organizing a search party for 2 missing boys. Seeing Jamie and Mark covered in dirt and wild-eyed, the relief was palpable. But so were the questions. Confined to their cabin under strict supervision, the boys were left to ponder the events of the day. That night, as the camp settled and the whispers of counselors faded into the distance, Jamie lay awake, the journal's words burning in his mind. The spirit, the ancient force they had unwittingly awakened, was restless, its cries a siren call to the darkness within the woods. Determined to put an end to the haunting, Jamie knew what he had to do. The journal spoke of a ritual, one last desperate measure to seal the spirit back into its ancient prison. It required courage, a pure heart, and a willing sacrifice. The next day, Jamie volunteered for kitchen duty, using the opportunity to gather the necessary items for the ritual: salt, herbs from the kitchen garden, and a piece of quartz he found by the lakeside. That night, he and Mark would venture back to the altar to perform the ritual, to face whatever horrors lay in wait. As dusk fell over Camp Lakewood, the boys made their way back to the clearing. The forest seemed to watch them, its eyes hidden in the knotted bark of ancient trees, its breath a cold wind that whispered through the leaves. At the altar, Jamie arranged the items, his hands steady despite the fear that clenched his stomach. He began the ritual, reciting the words from the journal, his voice a steady chant that rose above the sounds of the forest. The air vibrated with energy, the shadows at the clearing's edge churning with anticipation. The ritual was working, but something was missing. The journal had mentioned a sacrifice, a realization that dawned on Jamie as the forest grew agitated, the howling returning, louder and more insistent than before. Jamie's resolve faltered, his chant breaking as the enormity of his decision weighed on him. The shadows advanced, tendrils of darkness reaching for the heart of the clearing, reaching for him. With a desperate glance at Mark, Jamie made his choice, stepping forward to meet the darkness with open arms, his voice lifting in a final, defiant chant. The darkness swirled around Jamie, thick and oppressive, as if trying to smother his voice and courage. Mark watched in horror as shadowy figures converged towards Jamie, their forms flickering and undulating like smoke in a strong wind. Jamie's voice, however, grew louder, his words clear and resolute as he continued the ritual, his arms spread wide as if to embrace the inevitable. By the light that guards the night, by the roots deep in the earth, I call upon the binding stone to accept my plea. Seal away the darkness, return it to sleep, shield the living, let peace keep, Jamie chanted, his voice echoing through the clearing, powerful and commanding. The air around the altar began to shimmer with a faint, silvery light, the quartz crystal resonating with a high, pure tone. The ground trembled, leaves rustled violently, and the dark figures recoiled as if in pain. The howling of the spirit grew desperate, a wail of defeat as the ritual's power took hold. Suddenly, the crystal burst into a blinding light, illuminating the clearing with the brightness of 1,000 suns. Mark shielded his eyes, and when he looked again, the shadows were retreating, sucked back into the stone altar, which now glowed with a steady, pulsing light. As the last of the shadows disappeared, the light from the altar dimmed, and the quartz crystal turned opaque, its energy spent. The forest was silent once more, the oppressive feeling of dread lifted, replaced by a tranquil calm. Jamie collapsed to the ground, exhausted but unharmed, his sacrifice accepted, his bravery rewarded. Mark rushed to his side, helping him to sit up. "Jamie, you did it. It's over, man, it's really over." Jamie nodded, a tired smile spreading across his face. "It's done. The spirit is sealed away. The camp, everyone is safe now." The boys sat in the clearing for a long time, watching as the moon traveled across the star-filled sky, the normal sounds of the forest resuming around them. They talked about what had happened, about the courage and the fear, about the darkness and the light. And when they finally stood to leave, the first light of dawn was coloring the eastern sky, painting the world in hues of gold and pink. Walking back to the camp, they felt a weight lifted from their shoulders. The camp was peaceful, the air fresh and sweet as they approached. The counselors and other campers were still asleep, unaware of the battle that had raged in the night. In the following days, Camp Lakewood returned to its usual rhythm. The campers enjoyed their activities, the counselors relaxed a little more, and the stories around the campfire were just stories once again. But for Jamie and Mark, the experience would remain with them forever, a reminder of the summer when they faced unimaginable horrors and found the strength to overcome them. The story of what happened at Camp Lakewood during that fateful summer spread among the campers and counselors, a tale of bravery and sacrifice. And while some believed it, others dismissed it as just another campfire story, a legend meant to scare and entertain. But deep in the woods, hidden by overgrown paths and the passage of time, the stone altar remained, the quartz crystal now dull and lifeless atop it. A silent guardian, a reminder that sometimes the stories are more than just stories. And as the years passed, the legend of Camp Lakewood grew, a tale to be told by those who know, to those who dare to listen, under the starlit sky, by the flickering light of a campfire. Years passed, and the legend of that summer at Camp Lakewood became a whispered heritage among the waves of new campers and counselors who dared to spend their summers at the lakeside retreat. The tale of Jamie's bravery and the mysterious stone altar was often retold around campfires, embellished and adapted, instilling a mix of awe and fear in the hearts of listeners. But as it often happens with stories, the truth mingled with fiction, and the line between them blurred until the events of that summer became more myth than memory. Yet, deep in the woods, where shadows lingered long and the canopy whispered secrets to those who would listen, the truth remained alive. The altar, now overgrown with moss and vines, stood as a silent sentinel, guarding against the darkness it held at bay. Decades later, a new generation of camp leadership, unaware of the old legends, decided to expand the campgrounds. Construction began near the forgotten part of the forest, the rumble of machines disturbing the ancient silence. It was then that strange occurrences resumed with a subtlety at first. Tools went missing, eerie sounds echoed through the night, and several workers reported feeling watched from the shadows. One night, under a blood-red moon, the ground near the old altar trembled, and the quartz crystal, long since dulled and forgotten, began to glow faintly. As the light grew stronger, so did the disturbances. A cold wind swept through the camp, carrying whispers that chilled the soul, reigniting the old fears among the few who remembered the tales. Sensing the unrest, the camp director consulted old records, stumbling upon accounts of the events from that fateful summer decades earlier. Realizing the danger, they called upon the now elderly Jamie, who had since become a scholar of paranormal activities and ancient rites, his life forever marked by his childhood encounter. Jamie returned to Camp Lakewood, his presence a bridge between the past and the present. He walked through the camp, feeling the pulsing energy of the disturbed site, seeing the fear in the eyes of the campers and staff. Knowing what needed to be done, he gathered the community at the stone altar, now fully unearthed by the construction. Under the light of the same blood-red moon, Jamie led a new ritual, this time joined by the voices of all present, their unified chant a powerful surge against the stirring darkness. The crystal shone brightly, pulsating with each word spoken, until a beam of light shot up into the sky, piercing the night. The ground stilled, the wind died down, and a profound silence enveloped the forest. When the light diminished, it left behind a calm that was almost palpable. Jamie, supported by those around him, smiled, his old eyes reflecting the moonlight. This place, he addressed the crowd, bears a memory, a duty that now belongs to all of us. We must respect and protect it, for it guards not just us but also the balance between our world and the shadows. With the ritual complete, and the legend no longer just a story, Camp Lakewood thrived. The altar was incorporated into the camp as a place of reflection and learning, a physical reminder of the camp's history and its guardianship role. Years turned into more decades, and the tale of that summer night, of Jamie and the spirit, continued to be told, a story of caution and courage. Camp Lakewood became known not just for its beauty and the fun it offered, but also for its unique place in the world of paranormal lore, attracting those with a keen interest in the supernatural alongside those seeking the usual joys of summer camp. Jamie passed away some years later, his legacy enduring in the camp's traditions, in the continued safety of the site, and in the hearts of those he taught to face their fears. And while the world outside Camp Lakewood moved on, driven by the relentless pace of time, within the forest that surrounded the old stone altar, time stood still, guarding its secrets and watching over those who dared to walk its paths. Under the canopy of ancient trees, by the serene lake, the spirits whispered their thanks to the wind, and the wind carried their songs over the waters, a lull to soothe the brave, a tale for the bold. And so, the story of Camp Lakewood lived on, a testament to the enduring power of legend, a beacon of mystery in a world that often forgets the magic that simmers just beneath the surface.